equality or inequality, I expect, and I think some of us expect, we discuss in different setting, whatever class we are. And our second keynote speaker, Ibu Ann Tickamyer, we sometimes call professor, doctor, you know, but in order to feel intimate, we call Ibu Ann, it's Ibu Ann Tickamyer. And Ibu Ann has been joining us maybe 3 times, 3 Indonesian, or even more. She is our friend, and she is our teacher, and I know her far more than that, maybe in 2002. She's one of our professors. I've never taken her class, but she's still well known, at least in Indonesia, for all OU graduate. But I think there is even a better person to introduce Ibu Ann, who is Ibu Ati Kusujati, who might be our host next year. Okay, so Ibu Ati is a professor in the University of Asheville, and then she has done numerous research together. And actually, they are preparing your book, right, together? So she'll talk a little bit more, not only about introducing herself, and also talk a little bit about Ibu Ann, and talk a little bit about the topic that she's going to talk about. Okay, well,
thank you so much, Mbak Aya. Yeah, Mbak Aya just told me this morning, well, why don't you introduce Ibu Ann? I was like, oh, okay, am I supposed to do that? Okay, let's do it. My name is Siti Kusuciati. I'm at Warren Wilson College at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. It's an honor and privilege to introduce our next keynote speaker, Ibu Ann Tickamyer. She is a professor emerita from the Pennsylvania State University at the department. The name of the department is so long. So the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education. She was the chair of that department until her retirement in 2020. Yes. She earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And then she was teaching at the, well, that's how I met her 35 years ago. She was at the University of Kentucky when I was students there, and she was my advisor for my master and my PhD degree. So we have been working together, collaborating for over 30 years, and we had a book together, and we are working on our second book together. But in addition to that, she also has 4 more books, so she has 6 books published. The most recent one is entitled Gender, Food, and Agriculture, and the Coronavirus, Stories of Harm and Hope. It was published last year. And she also had another book published in 2017 entitled Rural Poverty in the United States, published by Columbia University Press. And she has numerous articles published, and it's too many to mention right here. But her specialization is on poverty, inequality, gender and development, livelihoods, and political sociology and rural sociology. She was the president of Rural Sociological Society in 90-something. Okay. Yeah, so she's very well-known sociologist in the US, and also have been working on research and also projects in Indonesia for many, many years. So without further ado, I would like Dr. Tickamyer to have her presentation. I'm very excited.
Thank you, everyone. Terima kasih. You let me practice a little bit of my Indonesian. It's very little, so you can speak it. I'm very honored to be here. It's a very great pleasure. I really have looked forward to this. It's been a long time since I've been back to this conference, so this is a very great pleasure. And, Good morning, everybody. Selamat pagi in Indonesia, selamat malam. I know it's hard. I've been in conferences where I'm the one on the wrong end of the time difference, and it's hard. So I really appreciate everybody who is here. And you know what? I really appreciate being able to talk to a live audience, because after the last couple years of COVID, so much is on Zoom. It's really nice. As great as Zoom is, it's also great to have real live faces in front of you. Okay, how do I get my presentation going? Where's Patty disappear? Yeah.
How about the clicker?
Yeah, but
But it has been, is it called? Oh, yeah, okay, great.
Yes,
Yeah.
is this good?
Yep.
Yeah,
good.
great. Okay.
Okay, well, I won't go through the overview, but the theme of this year's conference is bridging the gap between inequalities. And unfortunately, there remain all too many inequalities in the world, and all too many gaps to bridge. Gender inequality is one of the most persistent, intractable, and universal forms of inequality. My talk addresses how it impedes sustainable development and management of disaster and climate change, and how its opposite, its converse, equality and empowerment, are critical for sustainable development efforts while addressing disaster and climate change in diverse landscapes of risk for Indonesia. Gender justice and women's empowerment are key factors in goals of sustainable development, climate justice, and the potential for creating meaningful social change, something we sometimes call transformative resilience. Okay. Why isn't it working?
Let's see. Is it on?
Terbalik.
Yeah.
Is it the right one?
Zoom.
Hmm?
Oh, do I have to do it on the screen?
Gonna try it one more time.
Okay, now it works. Okay. That was the same thing, I don't know what, he didn't manage.
Okay, so for all forms of structured inequalities built into the social system are unjust, create serious social problems for individuals and communities. However, the continuing subordination of half the population in an era when there should be little excuse for it stands out. In Indonesia, in the United States, right here at home for me, and indeed in most of the world, women struggle to gain full equality, to have all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, and to be empowered to make decisions that affect their own lives, and that contribute to the communities and societies that they're part of. Women's disadvantage takes different forms in different places, but the bottom line is the same everywhere. Most recently, as summarized by the United Nations, the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, the end date of the goal. And the social and economic fallout from the pandemic has made the situation even bleaker. Progress in many areas, including time spent on unpaid care and domestic work, decision-making regarding sexual and reproductive health, and gender-responsive budgeting, is falling behind. Women's health services, already poorly funded, have faced major disruptions. Violence against women remains endemic, and despite women's leadership in responding to COVID-19, they still trail men in securing the decision-making positions they deserve. This was written specifically about Indonesia, but it could be said about almost any country in the world. Okay, gender equality is a fundamental human right. It's important for its own sake, but it is also tied to many other problems and inequalities facing the global community. Although it should not be necessary to justify why women's rights and gender equality are so fundamental, it is well established that women's equality in their families, their households, and communities provide benefits to all, not just to the women themselves. Full access to and participation in civic affairs creates value for the society at large. The reverse is also the case, where women are excluded, segregated, subjugated, or denied access to the public arena. They, their children, and their communities disproportionately suffer. So, no. Sorry. You can see I'm technologically challenged. That's why I'm retired. One reason. Okay, in this talk I focus on the relationship between gender equality, women's empowerment, and how this relates to disaster and climate change in Indonesia. Indonesia makes a prime case for observing and analyzing these relationships because of its geology, its geography, and its social history that expose it to multiple risks from disaster and climate change. And just to illustrate briefly, this is a map of natural hazards. There are different estimates of how many take place every year, but in some estimates it's thousands. And where it's red is where they're the most extreme. Many of those are volcanoes, but there are other sources also. And you can see basically the only country that rivals Indonesia for risk is the Philippines. The same thing is true for climate change. The redder the area, the more it is subject to climate change related disasters. And of course, one of the things about climate change is that it brings more and more severe disasters. So the two are really intimately related. Okay, so that's Indonesia. Its geology, in other words, I should go back. It's located in the Pacific Ring of Fire, makes natural disasters endemic, and climate change impacts imminent. In fact, they're already here, everywhere. The great geographic span across many islands includes large variation in culture and in gender roles also, in gender roles, relations, and practices. Its past history of colonial subjugation, authoritarian rule, and continuing record of graft and corruption exacerbate natural and anthropogenic or human-made disasters, as well as challenging the possibilities for sustainable development. Finally, the experiment in decentralization and devolution of power and policy to local governments and municipalities following the overthrow of the New Order increases differences in local and legal conditions that permit comparisons of what works and what doesn't in minimizing and managing disaster and climate change impacts. Put together, Indonesia makes an ideal location to explore these relationships. My colleague, Professor Buati, by all of her different names, and I have been doing so for almost 30 years. We've been looking at these things, both together and separately with different collaborators. Okay, what is gender equality and women's empowerment? First, let's briefly examine what gender equality, women's empowerment mean. Gender is a sometimes contested term as the relationship between biologically defined binary sex assignment and identity, female and male, and a socially constructed gender identity, gender roles and relations, attributed to women and men as either masculine or feminine. And as these become more complex in both scientific and ordinary usage. So there's a lot of discussion out there about what these really mean and what's important and what's not important. But look, this is the basic gender binary. Women and men are broad categories for socially defined and exhibited roles, relations, and practices that begin with biological sex, but more broadly reflect social learning. You learn how to be a man or a woman, masculine or feminine, in your society. While at the same time recognizing that persons may not always neatly fit into society's specified categories, especially when they're arranged as extreme ends as a binary. These categories are fluid. That means they're changing over time and place and always being reconstituted into new patterns and regularities. They're relational. We talk about both women and men and how they relate and interact and how this is the product of their society. Even where there is extreme polarization of gender identity, the so-called gender binary, there are impacts, costs, and benefits for both groups. So you really can't talk about one without also talking about the other in some form. You may emphasize one or focus on one, but you're really talking about the relationship. They are intersectional. What other sources of inequality may create greater or lesser differences within gender categories and across them. Social class, race, ethnicity, residence, many more social locations, as we call them, intersect with gender to mediate their impacts, to make them stronger, weaker, more extreme, whatever. And finally, they're performative, which is just a fancy word for saying that we all perform gender. If we're a man, we perform being a man. If we're a woman, we perform what women are expected to do. And so, as I said, it's ultimately based on biology, but there's so much superstructure built on top of that infrastructure or foundation. Social structures and institutions may be gendered in that there are patterns and expectations that vary for women and men, often involving disparities or inequalities that permeate most social activity and interaction. Gender equality is defined as equal opportunity, rights and responsibility for women and girls, men and boys. According to a Nobel-winning political philosopher, Amartya Sen, equality must be evaluated by the freedom to be and do what one is capable of being and doing, focusing on the ends, not just the formal means. And then mainstreaming and empowering. Also, these are all the buzzwords that we hear all the time about gender equality and gender relations. Mainstreaming and empowering are means to establishing equality by making sure that equality is real and not just something you pay lip service to, that it actually exists. Okay, let's see. So, that brings us to sustainable development goals. We should care about gender equality and women's empowerment for many reasons, but among the most prominent and pressing is to achieve sustainable development goals and to cope with the intertwined challenges of disaster and climate change. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015, link 3 pillars of development: social justice, economic development, and environmental protection and sustainability, in 17 statements that map an agenda for the future of the planet and its inhabitants. And this is the chart, or whatever you call it, the depiction of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 4 specific goals that speak directly to the issue at hand. Goal 5 specifies achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 8 states promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Goal 10, reduce inequalities within and among countries. And finally, Goal 13 specifies take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The other goals are also all related, but they focus on more specific things. Each of these goals has relevance for Indonesia and its efforts to emerge from the shadows of poverty, colonialism, authoritarian rule, and environmental destruction. As an emergent economic power with the world's 4th largest population and a history of leadership among non-aligned nations, it has immense potential for global prominence and leadership. Economic growth has steadily reduced poverty and increased per capita income. It's not, or at least right before COVID, it was classified as an upper middle income country, which is huge progress since independence. I think its status has been lowered because of COVID, but still pretty amazing. Transition to democratic rule with the fall of the new order in 1998 has increased representation and participation, and women's increasing educational attainment and activism have challenged highly paternalistic and patriarchal ideologies and practices embedded in both state and religion. However, the nation, with all that progress, the nation is also saddled with challenges from legacies of its past that make progress uneven at best. Poverty and inequality remain widespread and unfortunately increased with the COVID-19 epidemic. The majority of workers live precarious lives. Approximately 60% of the labor force, according to the ILO, is classified as informal, and women are disproportionately represented in that segment of the labor force. Democracy is undermined by continued corruption and money politics, and that toppled the authoritarian new order. Not that different in some ways from the past. Environmental degradation and lack of protection continues at a frenzied pace. Fragmentation of the state from devolution and decentralization results in the uneven implementation of national goals and policies. In summary, the road to sustainable development is full of potholes. Lots of progress, but also lots of problems. Okay, so where does gender fit into this? Indonesia makes an interesting study because of the variability, the contradictions and contestations that characterize women's position in the social order. Despite great progress, women remain locked into subordinate and domestic roles. Women have formal equality in the polity and economy, but remain underrepresented and disadvantaged in both. Under Suharto's new order regime, formal equality was both affirmed and at the same time undermined by the directives of official state ideology. Panchadharma Wanita, or women's responsibilities, that define women's roles as primarily domestic, while simultaneously conscripting their labor for national development. The contradiction meant that many women negotiated an uneasy relationship between increased agency and activity and a demeaning official ideology. State Ibuism, as it is called, promulgated a hierarchical, patriarchal ideology that used the family as the metaphor and the model for social relations, with Suharto as the father, the head of state and nation, and his whole family was the nation, who guides and governs his family by exercising male authority that descended from the top down to the ordinary citizen and male head of household and his family. Contradictions in women's status were further created by the requirement to participate in state civic organizations. Women were policed by mandatory participation in those organizations. They were state-sponsored, hierarchically organized, involuntary, voluntary. Luciti and I you coined that term in our previous book. Women's organizations, the Family Welfare and Empowerment Program, or PKK. I'm not going to try to say the whole Indonesian name because I would give you a good laugh, let's put it that way. And Dharma Wanita that both dictated behavior and delivered important social services in local communities. Although coercive, they also provided an opportunity for civic engagement, social capital development, organizational network development, and leadership skills and experience. In theory, all women in all places were required to participate. However, different locales varied substantially in the degree to which they were active. These and the expansive growth of women's branches of national religious movements continued to mobilize women's mass participation after regime change and democratization, although at that point on a much more voluntary basis. They also have maintained strong influences on gender roles and practices, with many of the dilemmas and contradictions kept intact. Okay, so although women's protests are credited with initiating the demonstrations that ended in toppling the new order, subsequent developments have often worked to maintain a patriarchal version of gender relations with all its contradictions. One is the embrace of conservative interpretations of Islam that reinforce a separate sphere approach to women and men's roles that are not always equal, separate but equal. That's always been a problem in the US too. Second was the decentralization of government that resulted in increased local variation in gender-relevant programs, policies, and opportunities. At the same time that programs were being disbanded, women were making continual educational and labor market gains, which created new opportunities in many parts of the country and economy. Similarly, and again, this is also contradictory, efforts to rein in domestic violence gained great strength, reinforcing the contradictory messages and expectations. The bottom line is that there are very large differences in women's autonomy, agency, equality, and empowerment across Indonesia that make it a good place to study the relationship between the gender roles, relations, risk, and risk vulnerability. recovery from disaster and climate change, and of course, ultimately sustainable development. So, let's see about gender in disaster. There is a really large body of literature that documents women's vulnerability and disadvantage when gender strikes, and similarly in climate change and the kinds of disasters climate change brings. Women are more likely to be victimized in multiple ways, from being overlooked or excluded in planning and warning for impending disasters, to having fewer resources for surviving, recovering, both coping and recovering after the fact. This includes lack of assistance both generally and for gender-specific needs in the aftermath. Let me see what other slide this is. You'll have to. Okay. So the quintessential example is the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami that devastated Aceh. This provides the best, although the most extreme example of how gender influences disaster impacts and outcomes, and how extreme it was. I mean, I was there 18 months after it hit, and I took those pictures, and it still looked like it had been yesterday, you know, that we had just gotten there. Although exact numbers are debated, there is general understanding that women were overrepresented among the many thousands of deaths and casualties for reasons that are related to gender disparities. Similarly, as survivors, women were doubly vulnerable and victimized, both in the immediate aftermath and in the long process of recovery and reconstruction, where they experienced further restrictions on their movement and activity. Social exclusion with more social exclusion with constraints on participation in public affairs and civic engagement, and heightened levels of violence against women and children. Aceh is an extreme example, conditioned both by the scope and scale of the disaster, which was many orders of magnitude greater than the typical disaster, if there is such a thing, and the historical and political context in which it took place. This includes a long history of civil war and internal conflict, sex segregation and social exclusion of women from public affairs, and punitive interpretations of Sharia law. The many other disasters that regularly take place in Indonesia vary substantially in the way gender conditions and intersects with each of them. The result is a multitude of places that can be used to compare risks, vulnerabilities, and recovery. Professor Busiti and I analyzed disasters in Yogyakarta, Bengkulu, East Kalimantan, as well as Aceh, with the overriding finding that the status of women in each locale has a significant effect on disaster impacts and recovery. So what I'm going to talk about today is the three specific disasters that we have studied in greatest depth. Aceh, and two disasters in two different parts of Jakarta. The 2000 earthquake that struck Bantul and surrounding areas, and the eruption, the very large eruption of Mount Merapi in 2010. Okay, so three disasters. I'm not going to go into great detail on the factors that distinguish them, but you should know that they are very different. So comparisons aren't straightforward. They differ in many different ways. Nevertheless, they also differ in how gender is incorporated into them. Again, more comparisons. These are pictures from after Bantul earthquake, and that illustrate something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Okay, so what I want to focus it on is recovery from disasters. So women in Bantul, and that's you can see some of that, who had been much more active previously in the types of civic and social organizations described earlier, were much better integrated into public life before the earthquake struck, and were incorporated into recovery efforts after. Merapi falls somewhere in between Aceh and Bantul, with slower and more conflict-ridden recovery efforts, mirroring lesser degrees of women's social capital and civic engagement. Both of them make a stark contrast with Aceh, where women have been marginalized and excluded from disaster and climate change management and recovery efforts. Differences in gender roles and relations across the archipelago allow identification of the factors that make a difference in creating resilient families and communities who can minimize vulnerability, manage risk, recover from disaster, and manage climate change. And I'll return to that later, but what I first want to talk about, because all of that is dealing with how to deal with, how to adjust, how to manage when disaster strikes. And unfortunately, disaster can't always be averted, and climate change is already here, but we can cultivate resilience. Social capital in Bantul, which is a big part of the story. But resilience can be cultivated. A basic definition of resilience in the context of a disaster is the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, to absorb, to accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner. Concepts of resilience range from tinkering at the margins to maintain the system and keeping its functioning, to a more sweeping view that does not assume that recovery means recreating a basically unchanged former system. Transformative resilience challenges a static view, highlights the need to seek new arrangements and practices that work better for new circumstances, rather than returning to the previous state. It embraces the idea that change may be necessary in order to serve both human and environmental systems better. Okay, Benet and her colleagues elaborate this approach with a conceptual framework that characterizes resilience along a continuum that represents increasingly more intense, more extreme, and more costly forms of change. The three basic capacities that they identify, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, underscore that these are processes, not end states. They also argue that that the different forms are not mutually exclusive, but may interact and reinforce each other, and recovery, resilience may involve all of them. Nevertheless, they highlight the right-hand transformative side of resilience framework by linking these processes with well-being, vulnerability, and power differentials. They argue that transformative change is often necessary for both moral and practical reasons, because it is possible to recover and maybe even be resilient, but under unjust and adverse terms. Resilience can lag in the recognition of the importance of power distribution and social justice, so that outcomes recreate or reinforce existing forms of discrimination, disparities, and inequalities that disadvantage some. Resilience is linked with vulnerability because power differentials associated with vulnerabilities influence recovery processes. I'm going to quote, transformational changes, therefore, typically require changes to entrenched systems maintained and protected by powerful interests. When disaster is large, such as in our case study examples, or unyielding, such as those linked to climate change, the capacity for transformative change provides the means to scrutinize and address inequalities, systems of power and domination, and social injustice. There is no easy road to transformative resilience, since the more entrenched the power systems and holders, the greater the disparities in vulnerability and capacity for recovery. Severe shocks, and especially the evidence of the inexorable nature of climate change, may provide impetus for transformative change, but is not predetermined nor always destined to end well. Once more, Aceh provides an example. The extreme devastation of this tsunami brought settlement of the long-standing civil war and greater political economy, but at the same time, greater social exclusion and restrictions on women and girls. So it was half empty, half full kind of situation. The result is failure to achieve transformative change associated with well-being for all. Recovery was slow, poorly distributed, and with exacerbated vulnerabilities, especially to climate change, and presaged further environmental problems. Only with the possibility of transformative change that takes inequalities and power relations seriously can resilience be truly transformative. So, to briefly return to the results of our past research, we add to the body of work that finds that gender is implicated in every aspect of disaster and climate change. The gender roles, the gender relations, and practices found in a particular place have a major influence on the ability of the individuals, families, and communities to absorb, adapt, and recover when disaster strikes. Our analysis of the impacts and recovery process of the 3 disasters in Aceh, Bantul, and Merapi demonstrate how differences in gender roles and relations are related to variations in risk, vulnerability, recovery, and resilience. And we basically summarize what the differences are. We found that for individuals and families, impacts are lessened, recovery is faster, and resilience is greater when women have greater levels of public and civic engagement, are integrated into public space, have strong networks and social capital, have leadership and organizational experience behind them, and basically all of that summarizes to experiencing greater levels of gender equality. At the same time, individuals are not the only story in disaster and climate change. It's also the communities and how they recover, how they experience resilience. And we summarize that with gender integration. Mainstreaming is one of the key, as I've already been arguing, strong and legitimate local government and leadership, bridging social capital, absence of pre-existing conflict, and embedded conflict reduction mechanisms. Essentially, when women are more equal partners in family, social, and community life, they and their entire communities are better able to withstand the shocks and manage the aftermath. Bantul comes closest to exemplifying these capacities, and Aceh the least, with Merapi somewhere in between. While there are numerous differences that a serious study must acknowledge, a major one from the standpoint of this research is the differences in women's status and their experience and integration into political and civic affairs. In Aceh, in addition to long-standing processes of social exclusion, women were marginalized, segregated, and further excluded from post-tsunami recovery efforts. In Bantul, women were fully integrated into the economy through their past history of what was initially coercive participation in civic organizations such as the PKK, but ultimately politically and civically engaged with lots of organizational experience. They had substantial amounts of social capital to draw on, and this experience assisted their participation in post-disaster recovery efforts. The women who resided in villages high on the slopes of Merapi were less likely to have participated in strong civic organizations, with consequently less organizational experience, social capital, and little say in post-disaster recovery plans. And Busiti, Professor Kusijiarji is going to talk much more about this in her presentation later today. Okay, so let's conclude. Our analyses suggest that promoting and achieving gender equality, gender justice, empowering and mainstreaming women, and fostering inclusive development practices are key steps in planning for resilient responses to disaster and climate change. It's not a guarantee, but rather a step towards creating a more responsive environment that is more likely to result in recovery that is both inclusive and just. There are times when returning to the status quo or making minimal adjustments will suffice. However, given the severity of impending challenges from climate change, and given how entrenched power relations are, including gender relations, addressing these changes before and after disaster leads to what we hope is transformational resilience. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, for some of you, maybe the word gender is kind of foreign, but I want you to picture this. First time I know the word gender, it was in the 90s. I went to Ambon, And some women ask, we lost so many of our boys. Who are supposed to pick up the bodies? There's no man available, no kids, no husband. So we're the one who have to take up all of those bodies. Okay. At that time, oh, what does it mean by men and women? Those bodies need to be buried, right? So at that time in a disaster, doesn't matter, okay? Flashback, after the last Indonesia Focus Conference we had, and then we heard there was tsunami in Palu, right? Right, you know? And then I went to Palu a few weeks after that, and then they said like, picture this. What do you mean, like the first 2 days? We have nothing. We don't even have clothes. So there were box and box of things, but all of them are dresses, dust up. So a lot of men have no clothes to wear. They all have duster everywhere. We bring food. So again, that's just a description. Gender doesn't matter, especially in risk and a disaster. So that's why your topic is very important and very relatable. I think a lot of us are relatable. I spoke on behalf of connecting with Aceh and then Palu, Ambon, and all of the conflict areas that we visit. And I hope that some of you who have experiences and knowledge with what Ibu Ann shared with Bantul area, I mean, I hope that you can connect why the description about inequality in terms of gender role and climate change are so important. But I want you to wait for and write questions because we also have a great presenter. And this is, again, it's not about sexes or gender. We have the next speakers also women. Okay, Pak Bambang first, then Mas Doni. Okay.
Okay, I want to try give some comment with what Dr. Tickamyer talked about.
Okay.
I'm totally agree what he said, but I just want to try to see a bigger picture of significant relation between gender and disaster. Okay.
So Pak Bambang is from Medan.
Yeah.
Alright, so maybe that
Based on Islamic spiritual values, that all of the thing in this universe, in this world, is manifestation of God, including the woman. So those who want to be good in the eyes of God should treat best to the woman, something like that. Why we have a lot of disaster in this world? Because the men behave to the woman very bad, something like that. So there is a significant connection. From the perspective of Islamic spiritual laws, from our prophet tradition say that the best of you are the best to his wife. And the other tradition, he said, al-mar'atu imadul bilad, that the woman is the foundation of the country. So in Islam we don't what we call so based on Muslim scholar, nature is the shadow of God, the shadow of God. So that's why nature is holy, divine. So we should respect to the nature, yeah. And then nature is a big holy book that we should read, something like that. And then nature is symbol of love. So we totally agree with you. There is a strong connection between gender and disaster. I think that's all what I want to give the comment.
Can I say something?
Sure.
about that?
It's
So
Dr. Ann.
I think the world would be a better place if more people followed their religious teachings and
Correct.
precepts.
Yes.
I mean, the problem isn't the religion, what the religion says. The problem is how people
Yes.
act
Yes.
when they don't follow.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
so
I-
I appreciate your
Yes,
statement.
I want to continue what Mas Bambang said before, because the presentation said before that there are a lot of obstacles to progress. Among them, corruption, poverty, and the gender issue. So I would like, can you maybe describe about the issue of this gender in Indonesia, for instance? Is it a big problem, still a big problem comparing to Southeast Asia countries, for instance, or the other countries in the world? Maybe this is my question.
I think, as I said at the very beginning, it's not just Indonesia, it's not just the United States, it's not just any country you can choose. It's there, and it's different in different places, how it manifests itself. But in most of the world, women still are second place. They're not equal. And the sustainable development goal that countries are supposed to reach by 2030, as the United Nations said, we're not on track. Doesn't matter whether we're the US, whether we're Indonesia, whether we're Timbuktu, we're not getting there.
Okay, excellent. To me, what I hear from you, from also presenters, it sounds like there's two topics, and like UN has, both of these topics are big. It requires maybe big data as well. But the commonality in terms of the importance of interdisciplinary connection, in terms of whether it's different field, also whether different, because you mentioned sociology and etc. It's a different field, so that's one. And then also sustainability, because you have been working in this field for over 2 decades, right? And that's something that I want to ask you later on. So what I'm saying is that, we have 3 panel sessions until up to 5. And I was hoping that even though the keynote speaker will finish now, I hope that there will continue conversation, like Jamil's not here. But Pak Jamil, for example, will be in the same parallel with Ibu Aten and UN. So I hope that discussion on gender will also continue in the next session. So in the next session, so after this we'll have lunch, and after that we'll have panel session that are all online. So I hope that, online means, that might be, some rooms may be empty, there might be other people come, so I hope that you can participate and come. But before we go, let's give a little bit of appreciation to our great keynote speaker. Dr. Sarah Linardi, do you mind coming in front, and Ibu N, Dr. N. Tickamyer? We just have a tiny, Pak Bambang will give this. No, because so as a non-profit organization, we cannot give much, but we really appreciate the help and also the knowledge that you shared.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sarah Linardi.